Yes, hi,
Oh,
I'm here.
love the background.
Yes, it's the theater at Hierapolis where Epictetus was born.
Okay, great.
I'm not there yet. I'm not there exactly. I'm in Brooklyn, New York, but you know, it's a nice way of thinking about it.
Welcome, Massimo Pigliucci. Now it's time for you to talk about Stoicism, and you will talk about the guide to happiness.
Thank you. Well, hello back, everybody. This is a pleasure to be here. Of course, I'm not really there. I would have preferred to be in Ghent. It's a lovely city, and I've been there several times. But you know, the virus had different ideas. Nevertheless, I want to thank Jasmine and Thomas and all the other organizers of Stoicon-x Gent, because this is still a very good event. And you know, Don was talking about resilience before. Well, this is one way you show resilience. You don't give up on Stoicon-x Gent, you just do it online. And we're lucky enough, of course, that we live in a time where we can do this sort of thing. So today I'd like to talk actually about a new book that is coming up and my ongoing attempt at, in a certain sense, update certain aspects of Stoicism for the 21st century. First of all, a little bit of background about myself. My name is Massimo Pigliucci. I'm a professor of philosophy at the City College of New York. My specialty is actually the philosophy of science, and my background is in evolutionary biology. I was a biologist for the first part of my career. But then a number of years ago, I got into Stoicism, and then it seems like I can't stop writing and talking about it, as you will see today. What I'm going to try to do today is to present to you some ideas, some potential ideas about how to think about Epictetus in the 21st century. Epictetus was, as I'll explain a little bit more detail in a minute, a very influential late 1st century, early 2nd century Stoic philosopher. He influenced Marcus Aurelius, for one thing. And it was a household name throughout the last 18 centuries. Many people today have not heard of him, and I think that's a shame. And that's one of the reasons why I've been writing about Epictetus for a while now, to try to correct that the little problem. So let me see if I can share my screen. And yes. Jasmine, can you tell me in a second if you can actually see the slides?
I can see the slides. You're sharing.
Perfect.
The screen.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Now, let me see if I can see the slides. There you go. Still visible, right?
Amazing. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
A happy life.
Thank you. All right. So let's get started then. So that's the cover of the book that is about to come out on September 15. And as I said, it is an attempt to update Epictetus, Stoicism more broadly, but Epictetus in particular, to the 21st century. So let me get started with two obvious questions that might come up still in the Q&A at the end, but I'm going to try to do a little bit of preempting on these questions. First of all, why? And second of all, who the hell am I to update Epictetus? So the first question, does Epictetus, or in fact Stoicism in general, need an update? I think so, and this has actually been going on for a while, not just in modern times. My friend and colleague Larry Baker, for instance, a few years ago published a new Stoicism, which is one of the several attempts, as we'll see in a little bit more detail, of updating Stoicism. But first of all, more generally speaking, every philosophy, or in fact religion, and I think of religions as a type of philosophy of life, but every philosophy of life evolves with the times. You know, it's not like 21st century Christianity is the same as you know, the 1st century Christianity. It's not like modern Buddhism is like you know, the Buddhism of 2.5 millennia ago, and so on and so forth. Obviously, some of the ideas, in fact, most of the ideas are the same, but they get reinterpreted, they get updated. Some of them get de-emphasized because they don't go very well with our modern understanding of things. Stoicism in particular did evolve itself. There are three recognized periods of Stoic philosophy in the ancient world, the so-called early, middle, and late Stoa. The early Stoa is the one of Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, that Don Robertson was talking about earlier, Cleanthes, Chrysippus. The middle Stoa was characterized by people who were starting to move from Athens to the rest of the Mediterranean world, particularly Panicius and Posidonius. Those were both, Posidonius in particular was a teacher of Cicero. And then the late Stoics, the one actually we're mostly familiar with, or if you have heard anything about Stoicism, you're probably most familiar with, because those are the so-called Roman Stoics, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and so forth. Throughout these three periods, the Stoa, as it's called, evolved through internal discussions. Zeno disagreed with his own student, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus, who was also a student of Zeno and was the third head of the Stoa, disagreed with both Zeno and Cleanthes on certain aspects of Stoic philosophy. Aristos was one of the early Stoics. He was active about 50 years after Zeno, and he disagreed so much that he actually left Stoicism entirely. Dionysius the Renegade, that's another, look at the word, tells you that he was a renegade, meaning that he really disagreed fundamentally with some of the ideas of the early Stoics, and the Posidonius himself, the one that I just mentioned from the Middle Stoa. So Stoicism has always been a dynamic thing from the beginning, arguably more so than several other philosophies of life. It also evolved in response to external pressure from other schools that were active at the time, from the other Hellenistic schools, particularly in response to criticism from the academic skeptics like Carneades in Athens and Cicero in Rome, and of course Epicureanism. There were going back and forth discussions between between Stoics and Epicureans, which over time allowed every member of the individual schools to sort of modify their positions and come to a little bit of a better understanding of what they themselves were proposing. John Sellers has written a really nice book just called Stoicism, where he goes in detail in the discussion between the academic skeptics and the Stoics, and shows how that discussion actually molded the two schools. Now, Seneca, the first century Stoic, and the one from whom we have the most extant writings, has written about this in one of his letters to Lucilius, to his friend Lucilius, letter 33. And this is one of my favorite quotes of all time in terms of Stoicism. He says, "Will I not walk in the footsteps of my predecessors? I will indeed use the ancient road, but if I find another route that is more direct and has fewer ups and downs, I will stake out that one. Those who advanced those doctrines before us are not our masters, but our guides. The truth lies open to all. It has not yet been taken over. Much is left also for those yet to come." In other words, he was saying to his friend Lucilius, like, look, I consider myself a Stoic, but I actually disagree with some things that Chrysippus said or other things that Zeno said. And those people, I love this turn of phrase, those people, they're not my masters. They're just my guides. And if I find a new and better way to move forward, then I should take it. That's the spirit in which I wrote this field guide to a happy life. Now, since I wrote it, I have to address my second question, which is, well, isn't it a bit pretentious of me to write this kind of, who the hell am I to update Epictetus? Well, first of all, I'm in good company. Even though it may be pretentious, I'm certainly in good company. The Enchidrion, which is Epictetus' handbook, has been updated several times, or written entirely several times throughout the centuries. 4 different versions were produced to train Christian monks in the 10th century, the 11th century, the 14th century, and the 17th century. And as recently as 1995, Sharon Lebel, who was at one of the early Stoic conferences, produced her own version of the Enchidrion. Not only that, but Stoicism had been, in a sense or another, updated by Justus Lipsius during the Renaissance in the 16th century, and by Larry Becker, who I've already mentioned, in the late 20th and early 20th century. So this is definitely not a new thing. Not only the Stoics themselves, the ancient Stoics themselves, disagreed and tried to update each other and modify the philosophy, but in fact, there's been essentially a continuous series of attempts to reinterpret or reorganize or update things in terms of the fundamentals of the Stoic philosophy. And incidentally, I should say that even though today's talk is for a broad audience and the book is written for a general audience, including people who have never heard about Stoicism, I've actually pursued this project also in a more academic fashion. Those that are looking at on the screen right now are 2 of the technical papers that I wrote to sort of defend the ideas that are contained in the book in a little bit more technical, more academic fashion. So if you're curious, feel free to check them out. If you can't find the journals, I can send you copies of those articles. All right, so before we get into what exactly this update or this modification actually look like, let's summarize the basics of not just Stoicism in general, but Epictetus philosophy in particular, but especially for those of you who may not actually be that familiar with him. So Epictetus was born a slave in Hierapolis, which is in modern Western Turkey. And that was about the year 50 of the current era. We don't know his actual name. His name actually means, Epictetus just means acquired, because he was a slave. He was in fact acquired by Epaphroditus, who was a wealthy freedman, so a former slave himself. And he was also the secretary of the Emperor Nero, which is why Epictetus moved to Rome. That also means, incidentally, that Epictetus must have met Seneca, who was in Rome as tutor of the young Nero, although interestingly, Epictetus actually never mentions Seneca in his writings. Epictetus obtained freedom after Nero's death around the year 68. This was pretty common for bright slaves at the time. They would either purchase themselves freedoms themselves, or they were granted freedom by their masters, and that's apparently what Epaphroditus actually did. Epictetus was then banned in around the year 93 by the Emperor Domitian, because he was part of the so-called Stoic opposition. These were a group of Stoic philosophers and senators. Obviously, Epictetus was not a senator, but a group of politicians and philosophers who opposed what they saw as the tyranny of three emperors. Nero first. Seneca lost his life partly because of that. He was accused of being part of the Pisonian conspiracy against Nero. And then against the emperors Vespasian and Domitian. Domitian finally had it with these people and just sent a bunch of them in exile or killed a bunch of them. And Epictetus was lucky not to get killed, but he was sent in exile. Now he moved to northwestern Greece, to the city of Nicopolis, which still exists today. And he established there his school, and that school became the most famous school of the late 1st century, early 2nd century. Later, Emperor Hadrian was actually visiting on a regular basis. Apparently, it became somewhat friendly basis with Epictetus. And Hadrian is the one that picked Marcus Aurelius for the succession for the Roman throne, as Roman emperor. After Hadrian, the emperor was Antoninus Pius, but Hadrian told Antoninus Pius to adopt Marcus Aurelius so that he could get into the line of succession. Back to Epictetus, in old age, we know that he adopted a friend's child, because otherwise that child would have been left exposed to death, possibly because it had some kind of malformation, some kind of genetic defect. You notice from the picture on the right that Epictetus himself was lame throughout his life. That's because his master early on in his life, apparently in a fit of anger, twisted his leg. And there's this story about, until he broke. And there is this story about Epictetus where he's looking at his master doing that, and he says to his master, you know, if you keep doing that, my leg is going to break. And sure enough, the leg breaks, and Epictetus looks at the master and says, "Well, I told you so." So that was his reaction to having his leg broken. Finally, he died somewhere around 135, about age 85 or thereabouts, and which is fairly advanced age by any standard, human standards, but particularly for that time. Now, these two pictures are just going to show you briefly. One is the top one is the one that actually also has provides the background for me today in this Zoom meeting. That's the theater in Hierapolis, which is in Western Turkey, as I said, where Epictetus actually was born. And the lower one is a panoramic view of the Odeon, which is a small theater in Nicopolis, in Western Greece, which is where Epictetus reestablished his school. I was lucky enough to actually be able a few years ago to visit both locations. You know, remember the time when we were actually able to travel around. I'm really looking forward to going back to those places one of these days. All right, now let's talk about a little bit about the philosophy of Epictetus before we attempt to sort of update it. Before you've heard the term dichotomy of control, that Don Robertson mentioned during his talk. It's also referred to as Epictetus fork or the Stoic fork, and here's the way, that's the way I present it. So as you've heard before, of all the things in the world, Epictetus makes, and the Stoics in general, Epictetus is not the one that invented this notion, although he was the one that made it the centerpiece of his philosophy. It really became crucial for his version of Stoicism. And so all things are divided into these two categories, broad categories. Things are up to us and things are not up to us. I don't really like the word control because as we've seen even in the Q&A we've done, it does open itself up to sort of misunderstandings. So people say, well, but there are things that I don't control, but I can influence. Yes, absolutely, that's true. Obviously, Epictetus knew that. In fact, it doesn't use the word control at all. He says up to us, or that we are in charge of. So essentially what he means is the following. So things that are up to us are only and exclusively, according to Epictetus, our endorsed values, our decisions to act or not to act, and our considered judgments. That's it, okay? And why are these up to us? Well, because in a sense, as the Americans say, the buck stops with these things. If I express an opinion about something, if I defend a value, judgment that I make, or if I decide to act in a certain way, somebody can rightly say, hey, why did you do that? And I can't say, well, I was influenced by somebody else, or somebody else told me so. I did it. It is my endorsed value. It is my decision. It is my judgment. So it's up to me. Okay. The things that are not up to us are essentially everything else. But especially Epictetus mentions our health, wealth, career, and reputation. Let's talk about the health for a minute, since we're in the middle of a pandemic. So it's a topic. It's topical. What do you mean that that health is not up to us? Well, it's not up to us, of course, not in the sense that we can't do anything about it. Epictetus was very aware that you can do something to influence your health, right? You can eat a reasonable diet, healthy diet. You can exercise regularly. You can go to the doctor and practice preventive medicine. You can do all sorts of things. And that's fine, except that at some point a virus comes from the other side of the world and strikes you, and there is nothing you can do about it. The outcome, in other words, is not up to you. You can try your best. And of course, by trying your best, you maximize the chances that your health is going to stay in a good shape for a long time. But anything could happen that it's not up to you, that it's up to external circumstances or to other people. The virus striking, or you cross the street and a car hits you and you end up in the hospital, that sort of stuff. In that sense, health, wealth, career, and reputation are all things that we can influence, but we do not ultimately control. They're not up to us. The buck doesn't stop with us, in a sense. So notice that this distinction, this fork, sets aside external things on the one hand, to the right side of the screen, and external things include our body. Our body is considered an external thing by the Stoics, and internal conscious thoughts on the other side. As Don said earlier, obviously some thoughts are not actually under our control. Autonomic thoughts that come to our mind with no particular prompting, are not up to us. What the Stoics called proto-emotions or pro-emotions, with the things like blushing, for instance, that's not under our control. So they knew that even our mental life is to some extent not under our control. The only things that are in fact up to us are the things that we do consciously. Now, the bottom line in practical terms is that this is equivalent to the Stoic advice of internalizing your goals. And this was best put probably by Cicero, who preceded, of course, Epictetus, in his De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, one of the foundational texts of Stoicism, even though Cicero was not a Stoic. But he talks a lot about Stoicism in that book, particularly volumes 3 and 4. He says, if a man were to make it his purpose to take a true aim with a spear or arrow at some mark, his ultimate end, corresponding to the ultimate good, as we pronounce it, would be to do all he could to aim straight. Yet, although he did everything to attain his purpose, the actual hitting of the mark would be, in our phrase, to be chosen, but not to be desired. So what he's saying here, he's saying that the archer, a Stoic archer, so to speak, of course, chooses to hit the target. That's what he wants to do, right? That's the point of the archer letting the arrow go. But he also knows that hitting the target is actually not up to him, because it depends on a bunch of other things. It depends on whether the target is moving or not at the last minute, especially if the target is an enemy, soldier that may see the arrow coming and dodge, or it is up to external conditions, like a gust of wind could ruin the best shot. What is up to the archer is its concentration, his focus, the decision to let the arrow go, how much he practiced before actually getting into battle, that sort of stuff. Those are all up to him, but the actual outcome is not. So Stoicism, especially Epictetean Stoicism, to a large degree, is about internalizing our goals. Now, Epictetus is also famous for having structured his philosophy along what are called three disciplines, and the three disciplines are assent, desire, and action. Assent is about judgments. The discipline of assent teaches us to arrive at better and better judgments about things. The discipline of desire is about the things that we value. So it's about endorsing the right values and not endorsing the wrong values. And action is about how do we act in the world, deciding to act about things or not to act about things. Notice that these three things that I just mentioned are also the only three things that Epictetus says are up to us, right? Judgments, that's under assent. Endorse values, that's under desire. And decisions to act or not to act, that's under action, okay? These also correspond to the three major fields of study that any Stoic practitioner in the ancient times would actually study: logic, physics, and ethics. Logic, of course, teaches you about better judgment, right? If you reason correctly, you then arrive at correct judgments. Physics in ancient times meant actually what we call today the natural sciences. And so it was essentially about understanding the world. Well, that is what tells you what you should be designing, what you should not be designing. What should you be designing according to the Stoics? Only the things that are under your control. Why? Because the way the world works is such that those are the only things that are under your control. The rest you should take as it comes. And then finally, action has to do with ethics, because action in the world has to do with other people, how we interact with other people. Therefore, it's about ethics. Now we get to my actual field guide. The field guide is supposed to be a bit-by-bit rewriting of the Enchidrion. The Enchidrion, Epictetus Manual, has 53 sections. They're short sections. They're often referred to as chapters, but they're not really. Each section is just a few sentences or a few paragraphs long. And what I did was to go through it and basically rewrite all 53 of them. And in some cases, the rewriting is essentially in agreement with Epictetus, so it's just rendered with modern examples or in modern English language. In other cases, on the other hand, I actually tend to disagree with Epictetus' take, and that's where the update is coming through. So here's the structure of the field guide, which mirrors the structure of the Enchidrion. Now, a lot of people think that the Enchidrion does not actually have a structure. It's just 53 things, one after another. Incidentally, the Enchidrion was not written by Epictetus. It was put together by one of his students, Arian of Nicomedia. Epictetus didn't write anything, just like Socrates didn't write anything. Fortunately for us, we have Plato and Xenophon in the case of Socrates, who wrote down stuff. And in the case of Epictetus, we have Arian. But most people tend to think that there is no structure to the 53 sections of the Enchidrion. John Sellers, on the other hand, in the book that I mentioned earlier, Stoicism, makes an interesting argument that there is a structure to the Enchidrion, and that is the structure that I'm about to present you. And it is the same structure that I follow more explicitly in the field guide. The first section is just about setting things straight. We learn the most important and practical lesson from Stoicism, which is the dichotomy of control, or the Stoic fork, which is the one that I just explained. The second section, of the book goes through paragraphs 2 to 29, or sections 2 to 29, and it is about the first discipline, the discipline of desire, or sometimes referred to as desire and aversion, and that's where we learn to reorient our misguided, according to the Stoics, desires and aversions. The third section is made of, it goes from number 30 to 41, and it is about the second discipline, the discipline of action. There we learn how to behave in the world. It's particularly how to behave justly in the world toward other people. Number 4, which is comprises sections 42 to 45, is about the third discipline of Epictetus, the discipline of assent. And it's about training ourselves to think better, right? To prepare ourselves to improve our judgments about things and about people. Sections 46 to 52 are about what John Sallas calls the art of living. So this is stepping back to a broader understanding of Stoicism as the art of living, and we train ourselves in living better, living a better life through understanding the theory and especially practicing Stoic philosophy. And then finally, the last bit, number 53, is actually 4 quotes from Epictetus. In the original, Epictetus himself has 4 quotes from other authors, mostly Socrates. In my case, I just moved to Epictetus himself and consider him my sort of inspiration and ideal reference point. Now, as I said earlier, this is not just rewriting or updating the language of the Enchidrion. This is actually challenging to some extent Epictetus. This is a project that I started years ago. My first book on Stoicism, How to Be a Stoic, is essentially structured as a set of little inner dialogues with Epictetus, and where I use actual quotations from Epictetus. And you'll see if you check that book that there are several places in which Epictetus and I agree, and there are other places where I challenge Epictetus. I say, well, wait a minute, hold on a second. There are some things here that don't quite stand up to 21st century sort of analysis. And this is my attempt in this new book to sort of structure my objections in a more, or my updates in a more clear and logically coherent, hopefully, way. There are, in fact, 7 of these, and we're going to go quickly through each one of these in the next few slides. Number 1, contrary to Epictetus, I don't think externals need to be despised, and we'll see in a minute what I mean. Number 2, there is no need to cultivate indifference for human loss. This has come up in one of the questions to Don Robertson, right? So should you really go around saying to somebody who's lost their child that, well, you know, it's not a big deal. It's just your opinion, that sort of stuff. I don't think we should. Number 3, live according to nature, which is a Stoic motto that started out from early on, from Zeno, and we need to update, I think, what it means. Number 4, there are some questionable science and metaphysics in the Enchidrion and in Stoicism more general, which I think needs to be updated. Number 5, which is really a subset of number 4, it's about the so-called God or Adam's question. We'll see in a minute what that means, but it's essentially about Stoic theology. Number 6 is local customs. Is about local customs, which they're not universal or immutable. There are a lot of bits and pieces in both Epictetus and the other Stoics, where you clearly can feel that the influence of the local of the time and place in which these people were alive. Right? It's ancient Rome or ancient Greece, and we live in a different time and different place, and so it's only logical that we sort of put certain things in a different way because we do think differently. And then finally, the last bit is about social justice. There's actually quite a bit about social justice in Stoicism, in ancient Stoicism, but it's embryonic, and I think it needs to be developed. And other people, not just myself, have been developing it over the last few years. So let's go a little more in depth into each one of these. Number 1, externals don't need to be despised. So Epictetus, and sometimes even Seneca, actually actively encourage us to despise externals, such as wealth and health and things like that. The reason for that is because they get in the way of virtue. Fine. But that is really more of a Cynic take on things. The Cynics were clearly along in that situation, in that frame of mind, and Epictetus was, had a high esteem of the Cynics. Nevertheless, we are not Cynics, and we don't need to go that far. Besides, virtue cannot actually be practiced except on externals. In fact, Seneca himself and Epictetus himself, often in the discourses in particular, they often say, well, what does that mean to practice virtue? Well, it means that whatever happens to you, those are externals, right? You need to deal with it in the best possible way. The way Epictetus nicely puts it is like you need to play ball like Socrates did. What does that mean? Well, when you play ball, the point is not the ball itself. It doesn't matter what the color is, the specific material, the size. It doesn't matter. What matters is what the players do with the ball, right? And so the same with life. In life, according to the Stoics, sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get struck by a virus, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get, you make a lot of money on the stock market, and sometimes you lose everything in the stock market. Those things are what life is made of. What matters, however, is how we react to them. How do we actually play with these kind of balls that fate or destiny senses? Okay. So, contra Aristotle, who actually thought that the externals are necessary for a eudaimonic life, for a good life, for a life worth living. I don't think the Stoics don't think so. The Stoics think the only thing that is necessary is our own virtue. But nevertheless, our own virtue needs to be applied to something, and these are the externals, which therefore need to be despised. Number 2, no need to cultivate indifference to human loss, as I said earlier, right? So to embrace even death of a loved one, the way in which Epictetus does, may appear to be callous. Epictetus is not callous. He was, we know he was apparently a nice chap, and within the context of ancient Stoic philosophy, what he says makes perfect sense. The Stoics believed in a kind of providence. The universe was a living organism that was doing its own thing, and we're just bits and pieces of this living organism. So whatever happens to us is for the good of the organism. And therefore, we should not, Epictetus says, just endure it. We should actually be happy about it. We should embrace it. This is the phrase that later on Nietzsche made famous as amor fati, love your fate. But the thing is, I don't think most moderns actually have that luxury, because we don't believe in a providential universe that it's doing its thing, of which we are the bits and pieces. And therefore, for us, fate needs to be endured. That's the Stoic thing to do, but it cannot actually reasonably be embraced. Live according to nature, as I said earlier, is the Stoic motto since the beginning of Stoicism, and it meant different things to different people. Now, nature for the Stoics, as I just said, consisted in the living cosmos. And this living cosmos is a rational organism which is participant in the logos. The logos is the ability is a substance that allows something to become rational, to think rationally. We are bits and pieces of the logos as well, obviously, since we're rational animals. However, today, I'm an evolutionary biologist, as I said, so evolutionary theory tells us that no, rationality evolved, the ability to reason evolved in human beings only as an happenstance of history. It could have easily been very different. It's not the result of a cosmic plan of anything. There is no inevitable cosmic inevitability or cosmic fate about it. So live according to nature just means, as my friend and colleague Larry Baker used to say, follow the facts. As Stoics, we understand that we need to deal with nature as it is, with life as it is, and not as we wished it would be. So it's about understanding and facing the facts, and then doing the best that we can with those facts, whatever those may be. As I said, there is some questionable science or metaphysics in ancient Stoicism. For instance, the ancient Stoics believed in divination, the ability to foresee the future by looking at things like entrails of animals and stuff like that. Now, in that time, this made sense because the Stoics believed in the universal web of cause and effect. And so they reasoned that if everything is connected to everything else by cause and effect, then it stands, it's logical to think that I can look at parts of that web of cause and effect and then derive other parts, infer other parts of that same web of cause and effect. Well, sure, that's also the way in which, in fact, modern science works, right? We believe in cause and effect, and we do pretty much the same thing when we want to predict the future. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and people are trying, epidemiologists are trying to make reasonable predictions about where it's going and how it's going to go. And those predictions, of course, are not based on the entrails of organisms. They're based on scientific understanding of viruses and epidemics and so on and so forth. So we can reject certain parts of Stoic science, such as divination, without losing much in the way of Stoicism in general. By the way, the Stoics also believed in other things that have been superseded since. For instance, they thought that the seat of the so-called hegemonikon, which is our faculty of reason, our ruling faculty, as Marcus Aurelius calls it, they thought that it was in the heart. Obviously, it's not. It's in the brain. This God or atoms is the probably the most important difference with ancient Stoicism, and it's one that's actually controversial even among modern Stoics. As I said, the Stoics believed that the universe was alive and capable of rational thinking, and they called it God. Okay. The reason they thought that this was the case is essentially something very close to what we today in philosophy call an argument from design, or argument from intelligent design. That, in fact, you can find that in Cleanthes, in Chrysippus, two of the early Stoics, as well as in Epictetus himself. And if people are interested, we can talk about it a little later. And well, we know today, largely because of two blows that have been dealt with the argument from design by David Hume in the 18th century and by Charles Darwin in the 19th century, we know that their argument just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So it was reasonable at the time, it's not reasonable anymore. And therefore, we don't believe in that sort of created universe that is intelligent and so on and so forth. That said, Marcus Aurelius himself in the Meditations several times raises the question. He actually puts in terms of God or atoms. Atoms is a reference to the Epicurean metaphysics. And he says, ultimately, gods or atoms, we still have to get up in the morning and do our job as human beings. You still have to exercise the virtues. You still have to be nice to other people and so on and so forth. So even the ancient Stoics here thought that, what it is, gods or atoms, doesn't really make much of a difference. So we might as well bite the bullet and say, hey, it's not gods, it's atoms. The Epicureans on this one were kind of right. Next to the last, about this issue about local customs. So the Stoics obviously were people of their time, just like we are people of our time. I know that sometimes that's hard to sort of remember. We tend to think that this is the end of history, and this is the way we think about things now. It's going to be the one for the future, but it's not going to be. If history teaches us anything, people in the future, 100 years or 1,000 years down the line, assuming that there will be human beings that far into the future, will look at us and they will kind of say, look at those people, what they thought. Now, the Stoics were ahead of their time. For instance, they regarded women as intellectually endowed as men. Okay? They said this explicitly. Musonius Rufus says so explicitly. He was Epictetus' teacher. Seneca says so explicitly in the letter of consolation to his friend Marcian. Nevertheless, they still endorse customs that we don't need to endorse. The Roman Stoics in particular thought that sex can only be had for procreation and only within marriage. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to us. We think differently, and frankly, there is nothing inherent in Stoic logic that actually entails that we should agree with Epictetus or Seneca on this one. Also, if you read Epictetus or Seneca, there are a bunch of places where they're positively cringeworthy by modern standards. Even though they do, both of them say that women are just as capable as men of thinking and rationally, and therefore they should be studying philosophy. They're just as capable of virtue as men, yes, but then anytime that they want to disparage somebody, they say, well, don't be womanish. Those kind of stuff can definitely go out of our understanding of Stoicism with no loss. And in fact, there are several modern authors, in particular Scott Aiken and Emily McGill Rutherford, who have been exploring exactly these kind of issues, particularly the connections between Stoic philosophy and feminism, and they're doing excellent work on it, which I highly recommend. Finally, social justice. The ancient Stoics were also, again, ahead of their time compared to even other schools of philosophy at the time, but certainly compared to the common thinking of the time. For instance, they explicitly said that slavery is evil. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, said so explicitly in the Republic, which a book that he wrote, and unfortunately known to us only as fragments, but one of those fragments literally says slavery is evil. As I mentioned earlier, the Stoics fought against tyranny, the so-called Stoic opposition. The Stoics were cosmopolitan. They were not the only ones. The Cynics also were cosmopolitan, meaning that they thought of themselves really as having no national boundaries, as brothers and sisters of everybody else in the human sphere. So those are all very good, very, very interesting, very forward-looking positions. But they had no general concept of social justice. Stoicism is a personal philosophy of self-improvement. It's not a general, broad philosophy of social justice. However, there are a number of authors that are working in this regard to sort of deploy a Stoic framework that can inform issues of both environmentalism in particular and justice more generally. Those people are the already several times mentioned Larry Baker, Chris Gill, one of the founders of the modern Stoicism group, Gabriele Galluzzo, Kai Whiting, and several others. And that's what I also try to do in the new book. So at the end of the day, Stoicism has always been, I would say, and it continues to be, a philosophy that is alive, evolving, practical, and ethical. And those are all very, very good reasons to explore it, to practice it, to use it as your own compass in life. And my last slide is about a portion. This is not going to be complete, but a portion of the people that have been in fact working on modern Stoicism. Some of them explicitly trying to update it. Others trying to bring it back out to a general public. And you'll see all those people. Then you go to the right side of that slide, and you see most people from the modern Stoicism movement, including Don Robertson at the center top. The ones on the left, you'll see people like, of course, Epictetus and Seneca and Zeno. Larry Baker is the third one on the third row from the left, and so on. There's a lot of people that are doing this. I'm simply one of those who's trying to make a contribution to modern Stoicism. Very good. So that was my presentation.
All right, great. Thanks a lot, Massimo.
Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Massimo. I'm a huge fan of you. I've read your book also about about Epictetus, and I have a question because you mentioned that you think that we should not cultivate indifference to the death of our loved ones. But I also read in your book, in a chapter, Epictetus basically says that you have to think about the people around you as they are figs in winter, if you remember correctly.
Yes. Yes.
And as I saw it, it wasn't to cultivate complete indifference, but to basically prepare yourself to cope logically for the inevitable at some point, right? And
Yes.
also, I remember I also read Seneca, and he gave the metaphor of the tree being that, the tree is ourselves, the leaves are people who we meet every day. For instance, the person, into modern terms, the person that we might find at fuel station, and the branches are the people that are our loved ones, for instance, mother, father, our close friends. But they always, some branches fall, and then you also have the leaves every single season falling, and then new ones come out. And basically he gave the metaphor of people coming and living out of our life and us growing. I just wanted to understand how did you mean then not cultivating indifference? Because as I understood it, as in your book, it was basically towards that kind of direction, but
yeah,
I'm confused.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great question. So here's what I mean. The phrase "things in winter" is one of my favorite from Epictetus, and basically what he says there is like you shouldn't be hoping to have or wishing to have your friends or your loved ones present when they in fact are gone, either because they moved elsewhere or because they died, because doing so is like wishing for figs in winter. In other words, it's you're wishing for something impossible, and what you're doing in doing so is you're simply making yourself miserable, right? It's not if you wish things that are impossible, then your desire by definition is not going to be fulfilled, so you're going to make yourself miserable. I take actually that particular phrase by Epictetus as a reminder of the fact that we should embrace our friends and relatives and loved ones when they're alive, when they're actually here, when it's summer season, when the figs are in fact in bloom, and we should enjoy every minute of them instead of taking it from granted and thinking that they're going to last forever, because they obviously are not. That said, I think that my sort of pushing back against some of Epictetus' language is because I think we should acknowledge, as one of the early questions to Don Robertson was actually putting forth, we should acknowledge that, losing a child or losing a loved one and so on, it is not indifferent in the sense of, well, stuff happens. yeah, of course stuff happens, and we should deal with it as it happens, not by engaging in wishful thinking. But we should acknowledge that that is a true loss. Okay? Yes, it's indifferent technically, meaning that it doesn't make you a better or good or worse person, right? For the Stoics, the term indifferent simply means not that you don't care. It just means that it doesn't make you a better, it doesn't affect your character. It doesn't affect your judgment, right? So if somebody dies, even a close loved one dies, that's not going to make you a better person or a worse person in that sense, in that very technical, specific sense, it's indifferent. However, the language that Epictetus uses, and sometimes even Seneca, clearly is one of, you should just embrace it, just like it's okay. It's a mug is breaks, and that's fine. Your loved one dies, that's fine. Well, there's a difference there, right? Mugs are mugs, loved ones are loved ones. My child is a different thing from a mug. And I think there is no loss in Stoic philosophy in acknowledging that, particularly because we do not, at least most of us don't embrace the ancient idea of a providential universe. And therefore, as I said, fate is something to be endured, but definitely not to be loved or embraced. Epictetus says, I would be happy even to get sick if I knew that this was helpful to the general universe. Well, I don't embrace being sick because I know that I don't think there is a universe that is actually getting better or further along by the fact that I'm sick. But I do have to endure, of course, because that's what it is. It's happening, and therefore, I don't have a lot of other choices from a rational perspective. In a sense, what I'm suggesting actually is to move closer to Seneca's own positions, because Seneca tends to be the more humane of the Stoics. He actually says, for instance, in one of his letters of consolation to Lucilius, to his friend Lucilius, he says, am I asking you not to be distraught by your friend who's died? Of course not, because that would be inhuman. Right? So even he acknowledges that is the case. What I want you to do is not to get lost into your grief, to take it for what it is. It's a fact of life, and you need to deal with it.
I'll unmute. Okay, thank you, Massimo. Alexandros, I hope that answered your question. Then Peter Vreeburg, you are unmuted right now. Yes, Peter, yes. Can you say hello?
Yes, hello. Thank you. Thank you, Massimo, for your very interesting talk. I look forward to reading your new book. In the final slide, you mentioned the exploration of Stoicism, using Stoicism for environmental justice. That was very interesting to hear, because I also perceived it as a philosophy for self-improvement. So could you maybe elaborate a bit on that? Because it's a theme which is very has my interest, and in our household too. So I would like to know more. Thanks.
No, thank you. That is a great question, and it is actually one that, frankly, I've been struggling with for the last several years. And I'm going to try to explain what the struggle is. So often, if you go on Stoic discussion groups or something like that, like the one that Don has been moderating for a long time, it now has like 65,000 people or something like that, right? Very often, people pose the question, well, is this Stoic? Where this could be anything, right? Feminism, environmentalism, eating gelato, whatever it is. Is X Stoic? And to some extent, my friend and co-author Greg Lopez, with a different book, Greg Lopez argues convincingly that, in a sense, that's a misguided question. Asking whether something is Stoic or not Stoic is a misguided question, because Stoicism is about personal self-improvement, ethical self-improvement. Of course, it's not about just becoming a better entrepreneur. It's about becoming a better human being. And so, in a sense, in action, in its own regard, it's not Stoic or not Stoic, or virtuous or not virtuous. Is the action as performed by a particular agent that it becomes virtuous or non-virtuous, Stoic or not Stoic. Let me give a very simple example. Let's say that I decide to volunteer in my local soup kitchen, because now we are in the middle of a pandemic and they need help, right? So I can volunteer a few hours during the weekend and go there. Is that a good action or not? Most modern moral philosophers would say, yeah, of course it is, because you're helping other people. The Stoics would say, whoa, slow down. It depends on why Massimo is doing it. if Massimo is doing that because he genuinely actually wants to help other people, then yes, it is a virtuous action. But if Massimo wants to do it because he wants to post himself on Facebook showing other people that he's helping in the soup kitchen, or because he wants a line in his resume so his next job he can say that he's been doing that sort of stuff, no, then it's not a virtuous action. The consequences might still be good, but the action itself is not virtuous. So in that sense, it's a little funny to ask whether a general position such as environmentalism or feminism or anything like that is Stoic or not, because it depends on the agent, and it depends on the intentions of the agent. That said, it's clear to me that there are certain positions that are broadly construed, in a broadly construed sense, Stoic. And I can give you two examples: opposition of tyranny and cosmopolitanism. These we know from the ancient Stoics. I mentioned a couple of times in my talk that the ancient Stoics really did go after the Roman emperors, the tyrants, the ones they saw as tyrant. Cato the Younger took arms against Julius Caesar at the end of the Republican period because he thought Caesar was a tyrant. Right? Whether they were right or not, whether that was the right judgment call or not, that's a different issue. We're all human beings and we can make mistakes. I think they were right, but we can disagree on specific political positions. But if we're talking about opposing tyranny, clearly that's a Stoic thing to do. And sure enough, Stoics, plenty of Stoics have done that to the cost of their lives often, okay, in the past. The other one is cosmopolitanism. The Stoics were cosmopolitan. There's no question about it. Epictetus mentions the word several times, so does Seneca, so does Marcus Aurelius. Hierocles, one of the Stoics, the 2nd century Stoics from the Roman period, is the one that came up with this notion of the concentric circles of concern that starts with yourself, but then it is sort of expanded to your family, your loved ones, your friends, then your fellow citizens, your fellow countrymen, and eventually humanity at large. So those are general positions that I think are very clearly in agreement with Stoic philosophy. So the question here is, well, are there other positions that are logically entailed or in agreement with Stoic philosophy, such as feminism or environmentalism? Now, I tend to take a very minimalist definition of those terms, however, because I don't think the Stoics, that one can say, oh, this particular brand of feminism or environmentalism is Stoic versus another one. That one, I don't think it can be said reasonably. And also, I want Stoicism to be the broadest, sort of ideological and as well as metaphysical tent as possible. So I don't want to turn people off. At the same time, if by feminism we simply mean the notion that women are just like men, they have the same mental capacities and are entitled to the same rights, well then, yeah, that seems a no-brainer to me. And as I said, even the ancient Stoics essentially said this as much, despite their comments about don't be a woman and that sort of stuff. In terms of the environment, the ancient Stoics don't talk about the environment, although some of them were vegetarian for different reasons and so on and so forth. But clearly, that is something that we can agree in terms of, again, the general version of environmentalism, meaning we should be caring about the environment. Why? Well, because that's where we live. We live in an environment. And so we want things to be good for human beings in general and for life on Earth even more broadly, because we live here. It's our house. And so we need to keep it clean, in order, and well-functioning, and so on and so forth. Then we can have all sorts of interesting discussions about which particular, specific political positions may derive from that. And I think that there, the Stoics tend to be agnostic. There may be more than one, in fact, several different ways to cash out these concepts of environmentalism, feminism, and so on and so forth. And Epictetus himself says so, interestingly, in the Discourses. He says, look, the Christians, the Jews, he actually mentions Christians there. That's the only time in the Discourses where he does that, I think. They disagree about the specifics, but they all agree about the generals. They all agree about the fact that they want to be better human beings. They all agree about the fact that we should treat other people well, and so on and so forth. And that's what I'm suggesting, that there are some general principles of behavior that are in agreement and in fact are entailed logically by Stoic philosophy, but not specific political positions. Specific political positions need to be debated in the political arena. And so long as the people that are doing the debate are doing so in good faith and trying to do their best thing, then they're actually being virtuous, and therefore we should listen to whatever it is that they have to say.
Okay, wow. Thank you for this extended answer. Ruben Eisink, I hope I pronounced it well. Ruben?
Yes, hello. Thank you. Thank you, Massimo, for a great presentation, and also really looking forward to the book. The new book upcoming is in September. And there was a question that popped into my mind during the talk from Donald, and you can answer it as well. So we'll see. So it looks like Stoicism is a great tool for regulating your emotions. And I really like this quote from Meditations from Marcus Aurelius that says, don't join in mourning and don't join in ecstasy. And it appeals to me in particular because I'm dealing with bipolar disorder, psychiatric illness, and it's going quite well, actually. And I also think Stoicism helps me with that. And I'm wondering if this way of life, applying the Stoic lifestyle, may also be a substitute for medicine that's applied now broadly. It's called lithium. It's a mood stabilizer, and I'm wondering if it can replace the medicine and using the Stoic lifestyle in just instead.
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I'm glad you're doing well with the bipolar disorder. That can be really challenging. So I'm glad that. I'm going to try to sort of give you the answer, an answer that Don Robertson would be okay with, although I cannot possibly try to do his accent, so don't even think about that.
That's all right.
So on the one hand, there's a couple of answers to that. On the one hand, yes, Stoic philosophy in particular can help with a range of mental conditions, not just bipolar disorder, but also depression, for instance, anxiety, and things like that. Why? Well, for the same reason that cognitive behavioral therapy can help with those, right? Because cognitive behavioral therapy is based on very, very similar principles and very similar practices. So the difference being, of course, that you go to a therapist, typically to a CBT practitioner, only for a short period of time to learn those techniques, and then you do it on your own. Stoicism is a broader philosophy of life. It's not just a set of techniques. It is all set of techniques, but it's more broadly a philosophy of life. So it's useful for dealing with those kind of conditions, but it's also more broadly meant to be a sort of a ethical compass to navigate your life in general. Let me give you an example, so an analogy. If you decide to practice meditation, for instance, that doesn't make you automatically a Buddhist. But meditation is useful also to non-Buddhists, right? Because it's a technique that helps you do certain things, such as calming down, managing stress, chronic pain, and so on and so forth. Now, if you want to be a Buddhist, you don't only have to do meditation, you also have to embrace the basic precepts of the philosophy, such as that the major problem in the world is suffering, which is caused by a rapacious ego, and that what you should try to do is to deflate your ego in order to decrease suffering in the world, right? So the same goes for Stoicism. You can use just the techniques, or you can use the techniques and the philosophy, depending on what it is. So on the one hand, the answer is yes, and there's actually pretty good that Stoic techniques or CBT techniques will work either in concert with medication, or in fact as a replacement. There are some studies, and Don can probably direct specifically to the literature, although Greg Lopez and I talk about that in the book, A Handbook on New Stoics, for New Stoics. We actually cite some of the references where it looks like sometimes, at least in some situations, the Stoic techniques or the CBT techniques are actually just as efficacious as medication, and so they can replace medication. That said, I also have, there's a second answer, which is inspired by a colleague of mine here at City College, and who wrote a really, Lou Madinoff is his name, who wrote a really interesting book a number of years ago. It's called Plato, Now Prozac. And it's about philosophical counseling. It's not about Stoicism. In fact, I don't think he talks about Stoicism at all there. But it's about in general philosophical counseling. So this notion that you can go to a philosopher instead of a therapist and talk about your problems and try to figure out things in life, right? Now, in the introduction to that book, the title of which, as I said, it's Plato, not Prozac, Lou immediately says, look, sometimes you do need Prozac or lithium or whatever other medication. because the medication will go, sometimes your dysfunction, your mental issue is of such magnitude that you actually need chemical help,
Right.
medical help, to actually bring down your brain to a situation where you can actually think in a more straight manner. But he says, once you do that, the pill isn't going to give you an answer to your questions about how to live your life. Right? It only brings you down brings your mind to a situation where you can actually function, and when you can actually ask yourself questions and try to figure out answers. But the answers are certainly not going to come from a medication. You still need a philosophical outlook. And all of us have a philosophical outlook. Most of us don't even think about it. We kind of take it for granted. We usually inherit it from a religion. If we grow up in a religious family, or from a secular family, then it's a secular outlook, and we don't even think about it. And one of the things that Don and I and a number of other people have been proposing is that, well, maybe we should think about it. Maybe it is a good time to from time to time, we should in fact stop and say, hey, what kind of guidelines am I using for my life? What am I getting my priorities? Why am I reacting to things in a certain way rather than other? And those are the kinds of situations where, the instances where you become a little bit more reflective, and that may be the time to explore whether, Stoicism or Buddhism or another philosophy of life is actually going to be helpful with you if it actually clicks with you.
All right, thanks.
All right. A few questions popped up again. Guillaume, I'll unmute you, and then Ruben, I'll mute you again. Thank you. Guillaume, please say hi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. First and foremost, Professor Pigliucci, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. And I'm indeed, as the others already said, looking forward to your book. And I would like to play the devil's advocate, actually.
Sure.
And for every person that introduces himself as a Stoic, I always wonder, how will you defend your Stoicism against a more Epicurean approach, how to be happy? So where the pleasure of the mind actually means a more virtuous life then. Especially what I experience is that's how our society nowadays works more, where the instant gratification of the ego is more central than...
Right. Well, yeah, that's a great question. And of course, that discussion, as you probably know, has been going on for literally more than 2,000 years, right? So look, to some extent, I don't actually feel that we need to defend our philosophical choices. If Stoicism works for me and Epicureanism works for somebody else, fine. I never actually argue that Stoicism is the answer. I think it's an answer. I think it's a viable answer, but there are others. Buddhism that I mentioned several times, for instance, and the reason I keep mentioning Buddhism is because Buddhist ethics is actually very similar to Stoic ethics, although the metaphysics is very different. Their view of the world is very different, but their ethics is very different. If Christianity works for you, go for it. If there's all sorts of stuff. There are some things that I don't think work. Fascist ideologies I don't think are good for your life or for anybody else's life. So I'm not suggesting that anything goes. I don't think that anything goes, but I do think that more than one thing does go. But since you asked, let me give you my answer about the Epicureans. So there is a colleague of mine, Catherine Wilson, here at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, who has actually written a book recently entitled, interestingly, How to Be an Epicurean. The title is modeled after my own, How to Be a Stoic. And the reason I know is because we have the same publisher, Basic Books. And a few months ago, before the shutdown, we had an interesting discussion at the Society for Ethical Culture here in New York about Epicureanism versus Stoicism. So these discussions are literally still going on today. Look, my favorite answer, the short answer, is the one that actually Don Robertson often gives when this kind of question comes up in the Stoic forum. And that is, the major difference between the Stoics and the Epicureans is the following. The Stoics agree that pleasure is according to reason or according to nature, and that pain goes against nature, by which they mean simply that people are naturally seeking pleasure and naturally avoiding pain. They agree with the Epicureans on that one. However, they think that the avoidance of pain and the seeking of pleasure should be subordinate to the cultivation of our own character, okay? And so in other words, to the practice of virtue. And sometimes there are situations where the practice of virtue means that you're going to be experiencing a lot of pain and really have little or no pleasure. And in those cases, the Stoics say, that's fine. That's the way it's going to be, and you should be, in fact, happy with it. That's what they meant by the famous phrase that the Stoic sage, which is the ideal Stoic, is happy even on the rack, meaning under torture, right? Of course, nobody's happy under torture, but what they mean, the word they actually use is eudaimon, which means the best translation of eudaimonia that I actually can come up with is the life worth living. Your life is worth living even if you're being tortured, according to a Stoic, so long as you are facing something for a virtuous reason. Right? Let me give you an example in modern times. Nelson Mandela, who did not identify as a Stoic, but apparently was greatly influenced by reading the meditations of Marcus Aurelius when he was in prison on Robben Island. So he was there for, he was in prison for 27 years. And you could argue that a lot of his life was horrible. He was in prison, isolated, tortured sometimes. This is not a good thing. For the Stoics, however, that's a good life. And it's a good life because Mandela was doing that in the service of a greater good. He was doing it in order to help his people overthrow the government of South Africa. Now, for the Epicureans, on the other hand, virtue is important, for sure. But virtue is subordinate to pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And Epicurus is very clear about this. I mean, I know that some modern Epicureans try to wiggle away from it, but I just reread Epicurus actually recently, and I reread what what Cicero says about the Epicureans in the first and second book of the Finibus, and it's pretty clear. So there's no question about it. That virtue is actually subordinate to seeking pleasure or avoiding, especially avoiding pain, because for the Epicureans the most important thing is avoidance of pain. So what Don Robertson often asks people is like, well, you can mix and match if you want, even a little bit of Epicureanism, a little bit of Stoicism, but at the end of the day, there may be situations where you're faced with the choice. Either I avoid pain or I do the virtuous thing. And if you do the first, you're an Epicurean. If you do the second one, you are a Stoic. And I do think that the Stoic way in that sense is certainly defensible. And it has led historically to actions and to lives that we think of as good actions and good lives. And that's all that Stoicism needs, I think, as a defense.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. You excel people by making a bridge from bringing knowledge from the past to the present. But the thing I'm most interested about is having the chance to meet the person who wrote the book and share the knowledge. So my question is, as one individual to another, what is the part of Stoicism that has helped you the most as an individual and clearly inspired you to write and keep learning about it and keep further refining your view in your next book?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And I'll tell you what the answer is. Very simple. It's the very beginning of the Enchidrion by Epictetus. It's where he says that the bit that I actually quoted in the presentation, where it says some things are up to us and other things are not up to us, and then he gives us these two lists of the two categories. When I read that was one of the very first things that I read when I became interested in Stoic philosophy. When I read Marcus Aurelius' meditations when I was in college. And I translated actually Seneca from Latin when I was in high school, because that's what you do in Italy. But I never put them together, right? I never actually said, oh, these are the same. It's the same philosophy, and it's maybe a way to navigate life and everything. That did not happen until much later. And when it did happen, it wasn't Marcus Aurelius, it wasn't Seneca, it was Epictetus that spoke to me. And that phrase literally changed my life. I was going through a little bit of a rough patch, nothing dramatic, but a few things that happened in my life that were not exactly the most positive experiences that I've ever had. And that kind of generated a little bit of a midlife crisis, if you will. And when I read that specific sentence right at the beginning of the Enchidrion, I said, holy cow, who is this guy? Why have I never heard of him? Even though I have a PhD in philosophy, I never heard of Epictetus before actually, contacting people like Don Robertson and Bill Irvine and things like that. It's like, what the hell? What's going on here? And so that made me, in a sense, fall in love with Epictetus. I love his sense of humor. I love his bluntness. I love the fact that he's so clear in his writings. You don't need to interpret a lot with Epictetus. You can just pick up the book and start reading it. It's pretty obvious what he wants to say. And that changed my life because I immediately started practicing the dichotomy of control. I immediately started thinking about, well, so let's see, how do we put this in practice? And I can tell you one of the first instances that happened, since you asked for a personal situation, a personal example. This is actually in How to Be a Stoic. I recounted this episode. And I was in Rome. I was getting on the subway to go meet my brother and his wife for dinner, which I've done plenty of times. Although I live in the United States, I go to Rome often to visit. And so I get on the subway and something strange happened. This guy in front of me is not making way, he's pushing back against me, even though there was plenty of space to go around. And so I start thinking about, why is this guy pushing back? And then I realized that he has a friend who's just picked my pocket, right? So, and I saw him just in the moment, the fraction of a second when he was getting out of the subway with my wallet in his hand. All right, great. Now, normally, meaning years earlier, when I was a little younger, I would have gotten upset and I would like, oh, damn, this thing has happened, and now what am I going to do? And this is a catastrophe, the kind of thing that Don Robertson was talking earlier, catastrophizing, which is actually a term in rational emotive behavior therapy. Instead, because I've been practicing Stoicism for a little bit, the very first thing that came to mind was the dichotomy of control. It's like, okay, that's done. You cannot go back and change your past. The past is outside of your control. So you have to live in the present. So in the present, what is it that you can actually do to address the situation? Well, the very first thing you can do, since luckily in the subway in Rome, you still have cellular service, is to get online and get in touch with the credit card companies and cancel the credit cards, which I did immediately. The second thing you do is get on a website of the Department of Motor Vehicles and get a replacement for your driver license, because that was gone as well. That I got immediately. And then I sat down and started reading a book, because fortunately for me, my Kindle was still with me. And I started reading a book. I got off at my stop. I met my brother. I told him what had happened. And my brother said, so you're not upset? It's like, well, would it help? It's not going to be helpful. It's done. It's over. It's closed. The damage wasn't that much. It was an unpleasant episode when it happened in the moment, but that's okay. And the rest of the evening was fine. We watched a nice movie and we had a nice dinner together. So that sort of stuff was made possible by the fact that the dichotomy of control has become kind of ingrained. It's the very first thing I think of as soon as something happens. It's like, well, what would Epictetus do under those conditions? And the answer is pretty obvious. Epictetus would say, don't worry about the externals. They are what they are. Worry about your judgments, your desires, your actions. That's it.
So Massimo, thank you first and for all for joining us tonight. I love your talk, but I'm interested in meta-ethics. So I wonder how a Stoic would answer the normative question. The question, why should I be moral? Whether there's a rational foundation to be moral. Maybe a Stoic would say that's the way to an eudaimonical life, but maybe there's already a value judgment in that. Or a Stoic might say that's the way to live according to nature, or that's the way to be wise. But I could say, why should I care to be wise if being unwise is much more fun?
Right.
You see, so is that a rational foundation for being virtuous?
That's a great question. The meta-ethical question is a great question. And of course, as you probably know, philosophers have been debating the meta-ethical question for literally millennia. In fact, that question you just raised was asked by Glaucon to Socrates in Plato's Republic. And it's so literally 24 centuries of these kind of discussions in the Western tradition, right? Yes, the Stoics do have an answer to that, and I think it's a really good answer. I mean, whether it is the answer, again, I'm not going to go as far as saying as pushing it that far, but I think it is a pretty damn good answer. So Stoic ethics is a naturalistic ethics, okay, which in my mind is the only kind of viable ethics. I don't believe that, unlike Kant, for instance, who thought that the moral law is essentially, in a sense, written in it's a law of nature. I don't believe so. I think that ethics is a human invention, is a human construction. that is meant to, that is useful to live together with other people, and therefore it is in a sense an accident of evolution. Okay, I don't think it's written out there anywhere in a Kantian sense. By the same token, I'm also not a moral relativist. I don't believe that anything goes. I don't believe that morality is just a matter of opinion, that your opinion is just as good as mine. Well, yours might be just as good as mine, but that anybody's opinion is just as good as anybody else's. I don't believe that. And those are the two extremes. The first one that I just defined is, the Kantian position basically is what philosophers refer to as moral realism, meaning you think that the moral law is real. It's like a law of nature, like the law of gravity. And the opposite is the complete relativism, where you reject any kind of objective status to morality. The Stoics were intermediate between the two positions. They were ethical naturalists. Ethical naturalism means that, and by the way, so are many modern philosophers. Existentialists are ethical naturalists, pragmatists are the same, secular humanists are the same, and so on and so forth. So there's a number of positions about that are all ethical, variation on ethical naturalism. And in fact, you actually yourself in your question hit on a couple of aspects that are important to ethical naturalists. First of all, yes, it is according to nature, meaning specifically that human beings are, the species Homo sapiens is a species of highly social animals. Okay? We live and especially we thrive only in a social group. We really don't do very well alone. So we evolved pro-social instincts, just like other social primates, such as the bonobos, the pygmy chimpanzees, and a number of others. So we have a innate sense, it's sort of a natural propensity to be cooperative to other people and to be more or less nice to other people. And the Stoics had figured that one out, although they had never heard of evolution, of course, and they never heard of anything like that. But they deploy this argument that it's called okaiosis. The Greek term is okaiosis, which means appropriation of other people's concerns. And basically they said, look, the human being starts as a selfish organism. The human infant tries to do whatever it is best for himself. Okay, defend himself from danger, eat food, and so on and so forth. And then, however, immediately starts showing the beginnings of a pro-social attitude. We care and we're interested in what our immediate relatives, caretakers are doing. And then once we develop the ability to reason about things, we start caring about other people, friends, and even people that live with us, in a broader community. So in a sense, so the first part of the answer is it comes natural to human beings to be pro-social. The only non-pro-social human beings are psychopaths. And those are people who arguably, whose brains are defective, right? They're not working well. They're not working as natural selection meant them to work. That's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that if you notice, I said that even according to the ancient Stoics, ethics begins with the self, with the individual, right? So Stoicism, and like any other natural philosophy, in a sense, is a type of enlightened self-interest. What is ethical? The reason it's good to be virtuous, and the reason it's good to be, pro-social, et cetera, is because you live in a better world if you are. And let me give you a simple example. I live in a city, New York, where there is a lot of high taxes for all sorts of stuff, including for schools, because in the United States, school taxes are local. They're not distributed at a national level as it is in many European countries. It comes from local taxation, right? So a lot of people would make the argument, and I know of people here in the United States who make the argument, well, look, if I don't have children, or if my children are no longer of school age, why should I pay taxes for the local schools? It's not in my interest, right? That is narrow self-interest. Enlightened self-interest is the position that I'm taking, and it is, no, I'm perfectly happy to pay taxes for local schools. And the reason for that is because I really live in a neighborhood and in a city where there are educated people, because it's more pleasant, because there's less crime, because it's better for everybody. So I'm happy to do my share, to do the virtuous thing, to pay my taxes and to help out even with donations and so on and so forth, because ultimately it benefits me. And the Stoics made that argument. The Stoics, in fact, did not make this sharp distinction that we moderns sometimes make between self-interest and altruism. They did not. They said, we're all interconnected in a big web of cause and effect, the entire human cosmopolis. So whenever I do something virtuous, it helps other people, and it helps therefore me. And whenever other people do something virtuous, it helps themselves, and it helps therefore me. So it is both a naturalistic philosophy. It comes natural to us to be pro-social. It is ingrained in us by natural selection, and it is a type of enlightened self-interest. It is good to be virtuous because everybody gains. It's not a zero-sum game. Virtue is a multiplier game. It's a situation where if everybody acts fairly and justly toward the people, the entire society benefits. Therefore, every single individual member within the society actually benefits.
All right. Wow. Thank you. Thank you a lot. By now, we've been a little bit over 10, but hey, is everybody still here? Because I will unmute you all and then we can clap all together. Unmute. No, I mute you all again. Thank you a lot, Massimo and Donald, who is not here anymore. I think we all learned a lot tonight and it was super interesting. So thanks again. Okay, thanks again, everybody. I'll close off here and I hope to see you all in real life next year on Stoicon-x Gent 2021. Let's all cross our fingers for that. And otherwise, I'll see you on Zoom. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.